Здравствуйте, comrades. Welcome to Socialism Saturday. Socialism Saturday is when we watch the real deal, the real socialist. No democratic socialists, no Bernie Sanders, no AOC. We are watching the real thing. And we watch Socialism Saturday because what we have found is that if you listen to what the real socialists are saying, God, do they tend to show up in culture. You can see how their talking points from the far corners of the internet are making their way into our daily lives. If you don't understand something, you can't defeat it. And so we watch it together. We have a good time. We have got socialism bingo for the first time on Socialism Saturday. We're going to check out my word list. We're going to see if I developed a good word list. We're going to try to we're going to improve socialism bingo as we go. Okay, it's going to be a little bit of an experiment. But today we are going to be watching Life After Capitalism. You know, we watched a socialist webinar on Wednesday because there was a live stream from one of our favorite socialist publishers, Haymarket Books. And so we kind of maybe infiltrated and trolled their chat a little bit. But one of the things that we keep hearing from socialists like the publishers of Haymarket Books or any of the other presentations we watch is that they don't really know what they're going to do after they overthrow capitalism. They actually said this on this stream on Wednesday. They were like, "We don't really know what's going to happen after the revolution, but we're going to figure it out." And so I'm actually really excited to hear a socialist try to present some sort of vision for what life after capitalism looks like. Now, what we see on the screen in front of us right now doesn't really look like the most appealing vision in the world. I don't want to live in that type of utopia, but maybe they have something better, and we're going to learn about that. And actually, we've seen the presenter before. Peter was on some of you for those of you who have been around a while with Socialism Saturday or when we started watching socialist videos. Peter was in one of the very first socialist videos that we ever watched. I remember him. I don't remember the context of what video we watched him in, but he was legitimately in one of the very very first, like several months ago when we first started this little exercise. No, he's not the old guy. He's not the old guy. Some of you are going to recognize him when he comes on the screen. And so I'm interested to hear what he has to say. Now, what's interesting about this is that this was given about a month ago at the University of Pennsylvania. So you know that crazy socialist webinar that we watched last week that was all about like abolishing the family, and wasn't it great when they explained to us that part of their revolutionary architecture plan is kitchenless cities where no one has a private kitchen and everyone just goes to the commune to get their food? And wasn't it funny that the Biden administration wanted to ban gas stoves? Like, and we knew where that was coming from. It's coming from this idea of like kitchenless cities because they want to get rid of private kitchens. That was last week's Socialism Saturday, and we are watching another video from exactly the same place. This is from the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. Andrea Mitchell, as many of you know, is a host on NBC, MSNBC right now. And apparently, when she started her Center for the Study of Democracy, what she really meant was her Center for the Study of Socialism, because they have the real socialists lecturing through this center all the effing time. Of course, they call it democracy. Maybe real democracy has never been tried. I don't know. I don't know. But that's where this is from. This is about a month old. So it's really brand new. And we're going to watch it tonight. And we are going to put more eyes on this lecture tonight, on this one stream, than the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania has had on it since they put it on their YouTube channel 1 month ago. And we're going to talk about it. And, we're going to have a grand old time. Now, if you are new to Socialism Saturday, you might find yourself feeling like you don't understand what they're talking about because they might be speaking English, but they're speaking a whole different type of English. That's right, Trendolin. These people speak a completely different language. The words might sound familiar, but they aren't saying the same thing. So if you feel like that, if you feel like you're going crazy, if you feel like you don't understand, it's okay. and we're going to help you interpret it. And if you have questions, please feel free to chat in and ask your questions, because people in the chat will help you. We need to all work together to come to a better understanding of this. And I'm not saying I'm some sort of expert, because I'm not. I've just watched a lot of their content. And so, like, I mean, obviously I have to be here for every Socialism Saturday, so I'm learning new things every single time. And so we have to help each other. And if you have ideas in the chat about things that they're saying, please make sure to chat those in, and I will display them on the screen if I feel like you're making a really good, really relevant point. And we'll talk about it as well, because that's what this is all about. We need to understand the enemy, to understand how they're showing up in the world, how they're taking over institutions, how to identify who is a real socialist, because you'll start to be able to identify what's going on when you hear their terminology coming up in like a meeting at work. Yes, Robert, this is absolutely right. It's just a philosophy of destroying actual society. I would tend to agree with that, Robert. And we are broadcasting. You can see Robert's on LinkedIn right now. Hi, LinkedIn. I've added LinkedIn to my streaming lineup, and we're gonna see how long it takes me to get kicked off that platform, but we'll just see. So that's what we have going on today, guys. Now, just a couple quick notes before we get started. Number one, if you have not yet subscribed to my Substack, I really recommend you do. I post content on there pretty much every day at the moment about the woke ideology, usually focusing on the woke left, but that's not to say the right is innocent either. I'm not on the right or the left. I'm a libertarian. I think both the right and the left are crazy, but I do tend to focus on the woke left because the woke left are the ones in power right now. And so they're actually more dangerous. I'm not dismissing crazy stuff that's going on the right. The fact is that even though the right does control the House of Representatives, they don't really have much power in the grand scheme of things, despite what the socialists think. Isn't it funny that the socialists think that the right controls everything? The right does not control everything. That is a floral lie. That's not true. But if they did, that'd be a different problem. But we're going to save that for a different day. So my Substack does focus on teaching people about the woke ideology, how it shows up in the world. If you missed the autistic sex education webinar, you need to go back and watch the autistic sex education webinar. You know, you can watch the stream on my channel. I still have the full stream up. You can watch it from start to finish. But what I've done on my Substack is I've broken it down and I've given you the highlights of the webinar. So if you don't want to sit through the whole webinar, you don't have to. And that's on my Substack right now. I've got other articles, like including the trans maxing manifesto. I broke that down and did a deep dive into that. So lots of content on my Substack. And I am asking, guys, I am doing a little bit of a membership drive. I want to hit 100 new paying supporters on my Substack this month. I'm about halfway there right now, so we're right on track. And the whole thing is, if I hit 100 new paying supporters, that means I can keep all the content on my Substack open and free for everyone. But if I don't, I'm going to need to start instituting a paywall, because there's just certain economic realities with how much time I have to spend doing this stuff. For this autistic sex education thing, I had to stay up to 4 a.m. to make the 17 clips to break it down for you guys. And so this does require a lot of time. And so I'm hopeful that people with the financial means will contribute. We're talking about $5 a month, guys, $5 a month, $50 a year. That's doable for most people. And if you appreciate my content, if you're consuming it on a regular basis, I do hope you will financially support it, because that is the thing that allows me to do things like Socialism Saturday, like autistic sex ed webinar, like trans maxing manual, like all this stuff. So I really do appreciate it. And if you can't contribute financially, because not everyone is in a position to do so, please share my content. Help me spread the word. Help me get it out there. It's not always easy being shadow banned. Like you gotta do things in other ways. And so I do appreciate that. Well, it's $50 a year though, because you get a little deal if you do it as an annual, Kurt. I know how to do math too. Listen, I know, trying to correct me. I know what listen, look at this. If you go to subscribe, $50 a year. So it's $4.17 a month. I know my math, Kurt. Jeez. So that would really help me out, guys. That's really great. Now, if you don't want to support me on Substack, that's cool, man. I have other options, including my locals community, which my locals community is the best community on all of locals. You'll never tell me otherwise. We also have Patreon if you want to do that. There's one-time gifts. Whatever you feel most comfortable, whatever you want to do, and that would be really great. And I do appreciate it. And if you do become a supporter, then you get access to special perks like my supporter Discord. Tomorrow we are watching Equilibrium for movie night in my supporter Discord. When you get on the Discord, we do movie nights every Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern time, so you can come watch some great movies with us. This is Jennifer January because Jennifer is our movie night host, and her birthday was just the other day, so happy birthday again to Jennifer. Jennifer gets to pick out all the movies in the month of January. She's selected Equilibrium, which is an excellent dystopian classic. If you have never seen it, we will be watching at 8 p.m. tomorrow evening in the Substack. And so that's one of the perks you're going to get. Also, we are doing book club. We are reading Ender's Game for book club right now. Book club is going to be coming up next month. So you have plenty of time to read Ender's Game, to get a copy of the audiobook. It is a wonderful, wonderful book. And if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. And that would be great. Sin says, don't forget to say the rules. Someone needs to hear it. I don't know who needs to hear it, Sin. Maybe I haven't been paying close enough attention. But I will say, guys, the rules of the chat are this. Don't be a dick and no whining. Okay? That's it. Don't be a dick. No whining. If I ask you to stop doing something and you say, I'm not doing that thing you're telling me to stop doing, that's whining. That is whining. And that's going to result you in getting banned from my chat. I do not have a non-curated chat. And so we need to make the environment nice for everyone because this is about learning. This is not about reeing. This is not about outrage junkie. This is not about any of the other stuff. I do not, like, if you want to do that, go somewhere else, man, but you can't stay here. All right, what else do I have? Oh, last thing. Well, second to last thing. Socialism bingo. So I do have to say thank you to Sin. Sin gave me a great list of buzzwords for socialism bingo. I added some in my own. If you want a socialism bingo card, then what you need to do is go to the pinned tweet or the pinned chat up at the top. And I'll pop this in the chat again. There you go. There is the socialism bingo card link, and this is just for fun. So what you do is you generate your bingo card. Every single bingo card is unique to you. You get a free square in the middle. We go for lines or we go for corners. And if you get a bingo, then shout out bingo in the chat, and you won't win anything. But we will give you a hearty round of applause and congratulations. And then we go for blackout bingo. After we get a single bingo, we go for blackout. We'll see how long it takes for us to get a blackout bingo on Socialism Saturday. And I think that this is going to be a fun little experiment. All right, guys. Last order of business is, I don't know about you, but I need a drink to get through Socialism Saturday. And today we're going to start with what I think is going to be a red beer. Look at that can. It's a socialist. Look, they've even got the bondage gear and everything. This beer, I don't even know if it's a beer. It's more like a malt beverage. It's called Liquid Rad Lollipop. And this is dedicated to Bot. This is raspberry, blackberry, and marshmallow. And I'm hoping it's going to be a nice deep red in honor of Socialism Saturday. Let's see. Oh, it does look red. It looks cool. Oh, it tastes like marshmallow fluff mixed with raspberry. Look at that. Perfect. A perfect red beer to start our evening. It looks like a smoothie. Cheers, guys. Oh, that's good. That's good. You know what this tastes like? It tastes like one of those pastries that has like raspberry and cream on the inside. All right. Let's get started, guys. Hang on. I just need to get my stuff together. Oh, Sin is drinking a baked apple pie hard cider. That sounds really great, Sin. All right. We want to go to full screen. And we got our captions on. All right, guys. Mount that like button if you are here for Socialism Saturday. We're going to do our best to explain what's going on. If you don't understand what's going on, just wait for it for a minute. Ask questions in the chat. It's all good. We are here to help. Let's see what life after capitalism looks like.
We're going to get started.
Oh, good volume for the first time ever.
And so first, welcome to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Miranda Edith Skleroff, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at Penn. This event is part of the Andrea Mitchell Center's Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy series. So thank you so much to the center's Dr. Jeff Green and Dr. Matt Roth for hosting us. Today, we are being joined by Peter Fraze. Fraze is a writer and socialist organizer living in New York's Hudson Valley. He was a founding editor of Jacobin magazine and is the author of Four Futures, published by Verso in 2016, which we'll be talking about today.
Verso is another socialist publisher.
Speculative fiction and radical theory to imagine possible successor systems to capitalism. He is currently working on a project that analyzes the false technological promises of capitalism after the 2008 financial crisis and the resulting economy of scams and asset bubbles. Today, we will be discussing his 2016 work and thinking through how the past few years of political, ecological, and social upheaval have shaped how we might think about the future. Peter's book speculates about 4 possible versions of the future: communism, rentism, socialism, and exterminism. Bringing to life what humanity may face in the coming decades. It's a pretty unique work, so I think instead of attempting to summarize it too much more, I'll just launch right into talking with Peter. We'll have about 45 minutes of us talking.
What the fuck is rentism?
We'll open it up for 45 minutes of audience Q&A. You can put your questions in at any time, so please go ahead and do that as they occur.
I wanna just remind everyone, please keep in mind that these people screw with language. And so oftentimes, like, they will try to sell you on an idea, but they'll explain the most optimistic vision for that idea, but they won't explain the reality of that idea. So it's kind of like how they say real socialism is going to do this and this and this and this and this, but real socialism has never been tried. And they're like, well, yeah, but like they don't explain the reality of socialism. They explain, in our ideal Marxist utopia, you won't have to have a job, you will own nothing, and you will be happy. And so what we need to do is try to read between the lines with what Peter is going to tell us and like, okay, how is this actually going to work? All right. Steven, I believe, are you talking to the lady or not me? Okay. Just like rein it back a lot. No, Steven, there's no need to be aggressive, all right? No, we're chill, man. We're chill. We'll make it a little aggressive later, but like just okay. I apologize. I thought you were yelling at me and I was like, what the hell? All right. Just like, see, the thing is that, and there's reasons to be pissed off. I don't want to make it seem like there's no reasons to be pissed off. I totally get it. I really do. I spent the entirety of 2022 pissed off. And if we're honest, I spent half of 2021 pissed off too. But like, let's just like try to be chill.
And we'll try to work through as many of them as possible at the in the second half of the event. So first, welcome, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
So we'll just launch right into sort of like the big assumptions, premises of the book. And so you start from the premise that the 2 crises that will most shape our future are climate crisis and automation. 7 years later, post-Trump, and still in the pandemic, are those the same 2 crises?
Still in the pandemic. These people think we're still in the pandemic.
How has the last few years changed the intensity of those crises or not?
This was a month ago.
So I guess, well, to take in some ways the easier one of those to answer, I mean, the consequences of the climate crisis have only continued to sort of gather pace and intensify. I think, it's more, it's certainly to me much more present and top of mind now, even than it was when the project that led to the book started. That's the, how we deal with, how quickly we are able to decarbonize and how we deal with the already kind of cooked in consequences of, what capitalism has done through carbon emissions and its overall impact on the planet. I mean, that's going to shape everything about what, the coming years are going to look like. And, if anything, each passing year, the sort of severity and the rapidity with which, rapid climate change is happening it becomes much more and more obvious that it's an immediate crisis rather than one that's sort of on the horizon.
That's a great point, Kurt.
The automation piece is a little bit more complicated. I mean, I guess where I would sort of go with that is, well, a couple of things. I think, one of the ways I sort of characterized the environment in which I was writing the book was in what I called sort of a wave of automation anxiety, which is a recurring thing in capitalist economies that goes back, to the Industrial Revolution, at least. This idea that capitalism's drive to increase productivity is eventually going to displace all the workers and replace them with machines, and what's to become of us, right? And I felt
okay, so I want to make sure this point is clear. We're going to do a little pop quiz in the chat. They started off by saying that climate change and automation are problems caused by capitalism. What do they mean by that? Why do they believe that climate change is caused by capitalism? And he literally just explained why they believe automation is caused by capitalism and why that's bad for the worker. Remember, this is all about the worker, right? They want everyone to be proletarian. They want to get rid of the bourgeoisie. Whiteness is another term for the bourgeoisie. Capitalist is another term for the bourgeoisie. They want the proletariat to rise up and displace the bourgeoisie, to get rid of the capitalist class. That's what their revolution is. So why do they think, so I mean, like, the automation one's kind of pretty clear, but like, why do they think that climate change is responsible, or that capitalism is responsible for climate change? Because there is a direct correlation between an increase in technology and the increase in pollution. I think that that's close. You're not like totally off on that. I want you to go to the next step though. Why do these people believe that climate change is caused by capitalism? Production means pollution. It's kind of like that. This is it. Fish addicts got it. The need to produce goods to satisfy the wealthy, and production requires fossil fuels. That's exactly right. They believe that the need to produce money to get a profit supersedes any interest that people have in the environment, and capitalism is the driver behind that. So capitalism, this is what they believe. I'm not saying I believe this. This is what they believe. What capitalism encourages people to use practices that are bad for the environment. This is part of why ESG is such a thing for them. And so that is why capitalism is to blame for climate change, is because it encourages people to do bad things for the environment so they can produce more and make more money. And it's kind of the same thing with automation. Automation is bad because it's bad for the working class, for businesses to automate things with machinery or with AI. And the reason that they're doing that is for capitalism to be able to make more money by hurting the working class. I hope that makes sense for everyone. And yeah, just generally everything is capitalism's fault. But it's important we understand how they're making that rationalization without agreeing with it. You can understand someone without necessarily agreeing with that person.
Like 10 years ago, maybe, or so, we were sort of hitting another sort of high point of that kind of anxiety about the robots taking all of our jobs. But one of the things that I
agree, Yasmin. Welcome.
Tried to do,
and your icon looks great. You're beautiful.
Because the point of the book was to sort of take this automation as this kind of premise and then play out some scenarios from there. But what I wanted to be clear about is that it's a mistake to think that there's an inevitability to this process of replacing human labor with robots or algorithms or whatever. And which is the way it's often portrayed in the sort of the literature of automation anxiety, whether it's coming from the business press or from politicians or whatever. There's a tendency in that direction, of course, because, again, of this drive to increase productivity in order to increase profits that capitalism has. But that tendency has other counter tendencies. And the main counter tendency, as I see it, is what the strength of labor is. That is, what workers are able to organize for and demand. And so if you have a workforce that is low wage, that is precarious, that is disorganized, that can essentially be used cheaper and easier than machines, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a low-wage labor economy rather than an automated economy. And I think on top of that, what we've seen is that a lot of, even my own sort of skepticism about where the technology was 10 years ago was in certain ways not skeptical enough, because I think what we've seen is that even in moments, as we've had occasionally in recent years, of tighter labor markets, some upsurge in union organizing, all the things you would sort of expect to put pressure on capitalists to do the thing they always threaten to do, which is, oh, if you organize or if you demand higher wages or whatever, we'll just replace you all with machines. But I think what we're seeing is that to a certain degree, that's a false threat, that technology is not there. And we could go into some of the many examples of this. Like, my favorite one to go to is always the self-driving car, which was supposed to, put taxi
Thanks for
drivers
dropping
out of
in,
business
Vince.
and so on. Uber was supposedly just relying on its low-wage labor force, precarious drivers long enough to get the robot taxis on the road. But and we've gone through this arc now where 15 years ago people were saying, so a self-driving car is an extremely hard problem to get a machine to navigate around streets and people and other cars. If we're going to,
I want to show this chat, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce Akshay. I hope I'm not pronouncing that wrong. I'm sure I am. Marx thought that industrialization I think that's supposed to be deprived people of meaningful work. Today's Marxists have stepped up and rebranded machines, technology, and automation now will bring extinction. I think that's an interesting thought. There is a fully automated McDonald's. Well, there are still people cooking in the back, so it's not fully automated because still people have to cook the food. But I mean, listen, if you had a labor force that was whiny like people like this, that were all like workers' rights, when, by the way, they accepted the job, they accepted the salary that went with the job, like they were probably really happy when they got the job, otherwise they wouldn't have accepted it in the first place. Like, if you had a staff of whiny people complaining all the time about how bad they have it because they had a job, wouldn't you automate everything too? There's a reason I have never had employees in the businesses that I've run. It's not because I couldn't, it's because I don't want to deal with this shit. I would rather do everything myself or outsource limited stuff when I need to than to deal with it.
Going to do, if this is even possible, it won't be for many years. And then we hit the sort of top of the hype cycle where, Elon Musk promises that the robo-taxis are coming next year. Every year, he's been doing it for the past 8 years. Every year he says they're coming next year. And there was that hype cycle, and now we're sort of back on the downswing of it, where people are like, oh wait, this is a very hard problem that we will not solve for a long time, if ever. On top of the fact that just replacing internal combustion cars with battery powered cars does not really address either the ecological or the social consequences of car-centric societies and development, but that's a sort of a whole other question. So that's sort of my long-winded answer, is the climate crisis has just gotten worse and worse, and the political consequences of how we deal with it more and more pressing, while in certain ways, I think the pressure toward automation is still there and is still something we should think about in terms of both its promises and its perils, but it's also sort of a busted flush in certain ways, and it's sort of a thing that is brought up both to discipline workers and also to give people hope in some sort of a better future, even when you look behind the curtain, often there's not a lot there.
Okay, and you mentioned that 10 years ago you were thinking that it was this high point of the sort of talking about automation. I think both in the mainstream and in sort of political left circles of thinking through automated futures. But so that sort of leads me to one of my other questions, which is, can you talk a little bit about how this book project came into existence? I'm going to ask you afterwards about the genre you kind of create for yourself, which again makes it kind of a unique book project. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how it sort of came together.
Yeah, so it had a very kind of long gestation. So it's back at this point, we're going back at a decade or more to sort of where the kind of key ideas came together. So long ago that this was when I was writing a blog, which is what we did in those days, and maybe we'll go back to now that the social media sphere is sort of imploding.
Excellent, thank you.
This was when I was still in graduate school and was sort of making my first forays into more public kinds of writing. And I often joke that the book is basically the consequence of a kid who grew up on Star Trek and then read Karl Marx. And one of the places that led me, as a
Marx is a bingo word.
Star Trek: The Next Generation, being the show from the 80s and 90s that I grew up on, was, looking at that, it was very much shaped by the sort of utopian liberal vision that Gene Roddenberry had toward the end of his life, where, you know, it's very kind of made explicit at certain points in the show that this is like a post-scarcity society, meaning material want has been overcome. People have what they need to flourish in life, and that what they do beyond that is really sort of their freely chosen pursuit of their self-realization.
Did he just argue that a perfect Marxist society is going to be Star Trek? Yeah, exactly. He should have watched Star Trek and then read Gulag Archipelago. I still haven't gotten through Gulag Archipelago. I have it all on audiobook, and I've like slowly tried to make. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. But Star Trek apparently is a perfect Marxist society. Remember, guys, real Marxism has never been tried because we don't have the technology of Star Trek. And the reason we don't have the technology of Star Trek is because the evil capitalists are keeping us down and are preventing us from developing the technology that exists in Star Trek. And so it's really capitalism's fault that we don't have the perfect Marxist society that is that is Star Trek, because capitalism prevents us from having Star Trek. I think that's what he just said.
And which is, in a sense, you know, it's a communist vision. You know,
don't tell him that,
it is the
Nick.
world of from each according to their ability to each according to their need, in a way. But it wasn't made by Marxists, it was made by liberals. And as a consequence of that, its politics, especially in the next generation era, are very underspecified. There's, again, sort of like what I was alluding to about mainstream automation discourse, there was this sort of sense of inevitability of, if you have the technology to, you know, give you what you need without, you know, without human labor, without it being ecologically unsustainable, then why wouldn't you have this communist society? It's materially possible, after all. Why wouldn't you have that? And of course, you know, that's where the Marxism comes in, of if you're starting from the standpoint of a class society like ours, things don't happen just because they're technically feasible. Things happen because of, you know, class power and political power and the struggles and the conflicts and the coalitions that arise from that. And so that then led me to the first iteration of this sort of this framework and this thought experiment, which was a post called Anti-Star Trek, where I was basically just taking sort of the post-scarcity world of Star Trek and doing the thought experiment about, like, what if you had all that technology was the same, but you still had something that looked more like capitalist class relations. In other words, a small group of wealthy property owners trying to maintain the power that they have in our system. What would that look like? And that led me into what eventually we're going to call rentism in the book, which is, you know, using intellectual property protections of various kinds to kind of impose scarcity where there need not necessarily be scarcity in order to preserve property relations, right? And so that was the first iteration. After I published that, an old comrade of mine read it and sort of emailed me and said, this is really an interesting thought experiment, but it's sort of interesting that you didn't mention climate crisis at all, or, you know, ecology. And so that gives you a sense of where sort of my head was at, and I think more people's heads were at back then, was that I didn't immediately think of that. But as soon as he said it, of course, I thought, oh yeah, you're right. That is something that's really needs to be worked in here. And so I did work it in what became then the essay version of this in Jacobin, that then led to the book, which is the structure. The essay is basically the same at a shorter length than what the book is. Where I came up with this sort of like two by two cross of, not only is there this political question of like how is society structured, but there's also this question of like,
he's not saying anything.
How bad are things going to get climate and ecology wise, and how are we going to be, how is that going to interact with the politics and the class structure of the society that faces that crisis? And so that was sort of, in the end of all of those iterations, the sort of full picture of the, you know,
this is full word salad, folks.
So also
words. Oh, he's a sociologist,
so
of course.
2x2 grid,
of course, he's a sociologist. It all comes out of sociology.
It reminds me a lot of Eric Olin's.
Don't let your kids study sociology.
Very famous 2x2 grid that was also I read about in Jacobin. And
I actually got a chance. I did get a chance to meet it. Yeah. I met Eric a few times. Hang on.
This is one of those times. This is absolutely one of those times that if you didn't understand a word he just said, don't worry about it, because he said absolutely nothing of value at all. That was total and complete word salad. He was probably just making it up as he goes. So if that made no sense to you, it's because it made no effing sense. And don't let your kids study sociology ever. When your kids study sociology, this is what happens to them.
before he died, and we were both speaking at an event once, like after the book had already come out, and I sort of explained, gave him the elevator pitch of what the book was, and he was like, "Oh, a 2x2 diagram. That's great. I love that."
So before we get into the futures, which we're about to do, I did want to ask you about genre. You call this book social science fiction. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how that's different from science fiction and how that's different from futurism?
Right. So, it's sort of, in a sense, it's not science fiction because I'm not much of a fiction writer. Although the book was certainly influenced not just by social theory, by Marxism and so on, but also by these sort of there's sort of the odd sort of fringes of fiction that sort of look more like social science. One of the more obscure ones that has influenced me a lot was Olaf Stapledon, who wrote about 100 years ago and wrote these books like Last and First Men and Star Maker, which are these books that sort of as if they're written by like an alien anthropologist.
So I want to point something out to you guys based on something that Covey is saying in the chat. Is he broadcasting this from a bathroom? What's with the polka dot shower curtain? Okay, so we were actually just talking about this in my private Bitchcraft call in my supporter community earlier. People need to learn how to identify the real socialists like this guy's from the pretenders, because there are so many pretenders on YouTube, like Vosh. Vosh is not a socialist. Vosh might pretend to be a socialist, but Vosh is not a socialist. And the reason you know Vosh isn't a socialist is because he has a really nice setup and engages in capitalism all the effing time. Vosh is a grifter. Vosh is a very smart grifter. Okay. And there are a lot of grifters that are doing this bread tube thing that have these big fancy setups and like lights everywhere and blinking things and all this. The real socialists, they don't have any of that shit. And we've watched enough Socialism Saturday to know that now. Okay. This is what it looks like for the real socialists. They have these weird curtains hanging everywhere. Usually everything is beige. If they have a color, it's red. If they have any color at all in their place, it's red. The women don't wear makeup except for like red lipstick for the most part. If they look like they are a homeless person, they're probably a real socialist. If they have piles and piles of books everywhere, or are broadcasting from their kitchen, and you see like unwashed dishes in the sink, which happens on a more frequent basis than it probably should, they're socialists. So all of these indicators are indicators that you're watching a real socialist. The people who have these fancy setups and they're all done up and all of this stuff, they're not real socialists. They're just playing. And it's important to know the difference. Yes, Vosh is a champagne socialist. Wah, wah, wah. Yeah, same with Hassan. You're absolutely right, Yasmin. Same with Hassan. I mean, I'm not going to say that.
Describing like thousands of years of, civilizational history. It's not like a traditional sort of narrative, but it's fiction, obviously. So that sort of thing influenced me. And, I was just sort of trying to think through what we can do with the tools of social science or social theory that's different than the sort of what we normally do in terms of analyzing the present and the past to kind of understand the sort of the structures of our present, the sort of the hidden social relations that structure the present. And I felt like a lot of the kind of science fiction that I like is the kind that sort of has underpinning it some kind of a social theory like that, something that the sort of world builds, as they say, that creates the sort of basis for why things are like this. And and Star Trek had enough of it that I wanted to try to sort of build out more of it, right? And so I thought this is at a moment where I was sort of on the trajectory that will eventually lead to me leaving academia and leaving grad school, where I was like, I wanted to do some different interesting things and do them in a way where I'm not just telling a story about the future. I'm also not predicting the future per se. I'm just trying to sort of set some boundaries and parameters for like how we think about where we are situated now and where we might go. both what the constraints and what the freedoms are. And that I sort of hit on sort of social science fiction as the sort of the terminology I wanted to use for that, as a way of essentially doing what you would do as a sociologist, except pushing it forward into the future rather than remaining forward and present and backward looking.
So in your book, you take us through a typology of 4 features, as we said, a 2x2 grid on how, based on how power is organized. So that's hierarchy versus equality, and how plentiful resources are. So that's scarcity versus abundance. So you did talk a little bit about how you came upon these variables, but what kind of futures do those give us, and sort of what kinds of, how is that different from other ways that people have sort of done social scientific-y fiction, or have thought about the future in social science?
Right. So so the first thing to say, I guess, obviously, is that this is the nature of an exercise like this, is that it makes distinctions and chooses what to emphasize and what to leave out in a certain way. And so I've periodically people will bring up elements that I don't really foreground. So if like culture and ideas, or religion, things like this are obviously moving forces in the world. They're just not things that I sort of put in the foreground. I wanted to sort of put both sort of the material basis of social life and its political and sort of social structure in the sort of the foreground of what I was doing. And so this hierarchy versus, the axis of hierarchy versus equality, I could easily have called really the axis of class struggle, because the specific form of hierarchy that I'm talking about in this book, for the most part, at least in terms of how it structures the overall sort of social world that I'm describing, is something like the capitalist class hierarchy, in which wealth and power is concentrated in a small number of hands, but also sort of abstracted through the medium of money. And that, obviously in a capitalist system, most people without access to the means of production are selling their labor power. And so, again, that gets back to this sort of question of like Star Trek versus anti-Star Trek, and like what are the power relations and the class relations and the property relations that sort of underpin how social life plays out at any given level of technological development. And then this sort of scarcity versus abundance is then also a bit of it can be a bit of a tricky or a misleading framing, because it's a particular type of scarcity and a particular type of abundance that I'm talking about. Because what is scarce in the sort of scenarios that I sketch out in the book is explicitly not human labor. It's not a scarcity.
What's scarce?
It's sort of not a scarcity of the human labor to make the commodities that run society. We're imagining the Star Trek world where you have the replicator or something like that sort of does away with the need for all that human labor. But that then the sort of ecological and the climate piece of it is where there is still an underlying, what's actually scarce is the things that capitalism historically has not treated as scarce.
Like what?
Right. That capitalism we've gotten into the position we're in precisely because nature was treated as a free gift, and the sort of externalities of capitalist production, the pollution and the waste, were sort of treated as things that did not have to have a cost placed on them. And so in a way,
then what's scarce?
Looking to invert that logic and say,
so is he saying our environmental resources are scarce? Again, this guy's doing a lot of word salad. What exactly does he think is scarce?
What if we make no longer, the things that are scarce now, our ability to get food, to get housing, to get healthcare, what if those are no longer scarce, but that there is still a sort of an underlying...
Our ability to get food, to get housing, to get healthcare is scarce. Okay, do we agree with those? Do I agree that my ability to get food is scarce? Well, no, I can go to the supermarket, although inflation is making that a little bit of a nightmare, which is it's partially Donald Trump's fault, it's partially Joe Biden's fault. I know conservatives don't like me to say that, but it's the truth. Inflation started under Trump, it didn't start under Biden. And so like, okay, you can make that argument, but is a socialist future going to make food... Well, it's funny. Victor was telling me just the other day. Victor always likes to get his 2 cents in when I'm doing one of these things. If for people who don't know, my husband is from Ukraine, and so he grew up when Ukraine was still like a part of USSR. And Victor was telling me the other day that like his family had to go and line up in like ration lines, like, and it would get around the city, like if they would always be able to access things like bread and like flour and like the basic stuff, but like if the store had kielbasa, or if the store had like a very specific type of like women's boots that his aunt wanted or something, like that would get around the city and people would go and stand in these ration lines for like miles to be able to get the kielbasa at the store, because they didn't have kielbasa every day, because kielbasa under actual socialism or communism, whatever, was scarce. And so they only had kielbasa like every once in a while. So everyone wanted it. So does inflation suck at the supermarket? Yeah, it does kind of suck. It does. It really does. But the problem is that under his system, we're going to be waiting in lines a mile long to be able to buy a fucking steak.
Scarcity of like what can our ecosystem sustain, right? Like one other thing that I clearly wanted to foreclose, right, was, I mean, and this certainly I think has been borne out, is like, we ain't going to Mars, folks. Like that there's certain like I can imagine myself into a lot of kind of near and medium future scenarios that are kind of wild, but human civilization that is not primarily based on the Earth's ecosystem for the vast majority of us is like not one of those things I can imagine myself out of.
Exactly.
Based on, I think, what reasonable physical and social science tells us today. And so those were the boundaries that I wanted to set in terms of what I wanted to talk about and what the particular kinds of hierarchies that I wanted to think about either preserving or overcoming, and the particular kind of scarcity or abundance that sort of ecological basis might provide.
So I think that this is not overstating. Your most optimistic version of the future is the communistic future that you describe, which has both equality and abundance. And you do hazard some ideas of things that might get us closer to that version of the future that are sort of like policy oriented. And one of them is UBI, or universal basic income.
Oh,
is
no.
Universal basic income still kind of top of your list as a sort of revolutionary reform? Or have you seen other kinds of policies that maybe in the past few years, or that have been at least floated in the past few years, that might do that better or are more likely to happen?
I still think there's not really a substitute for universal basic income as both a demand and something to sort of think with, in terms of its recognition that we still are operating in, a monetized society in which access to the cash nexus is paramount for most of our survival, while trying to break that sort of connection between selling your labor and gaining an income that's so foundational to the way that capitalist hierarchies work. I do think it's, the basic income is another thing that has gotten a lot more sort of popular discussion over the last decade. And I do think it's important to situate it in the right way, because there's sort of some blind alleys you can go down with it that I think we've seen more and more in recent years. So there was a debate, for example, there's been a recurring debate between
Chad, I literally made me laugh out loud. Yes, there is a substitute for universal basic income. It's called a job. I mean, I think that, I think there is something to be said for the idea that I do think more people, well, okay, I don't actually think it would play out this way. My hope would be that if we had universal basic income, people would take the opportunity to be more entrepreneurial, and to build their own businesses. That would be my hope, because there'd be that little bit of a cushion. And I know that when I started my own business full time, God, that cushion, even just a little tiny bit of a cushion, really would have helped. It would have helped me make me feel so much more comfortable. However, what we learned during the pandemic is that most people are too fucking lazy. I'm sorry. They're too lazy. Most people had these enhanced, well, not most people, but like a lot of people had these enhanced like unemployment benefits during the pandemic when they couldn't find a job, and it provided them no incentive to do work at all. They had all this time on their hands. They were getting these enhanced unemployment benefits. They had all this time to be able to develop their own businesses, and they didn't do it. And I think it was just one of the biggest waste of times ever. So I'm not in favor of universal basic income. I like the utopian ideal of it, but in practical reality, it just doesn't work. I mean, I would love for that. That would be I think that would actually, to be honest, eliminating the income tax, man, how great would that be? I mean, we don't pay income tax in New Hampshire, and it's like it's such a difference just in not having that state level income tax.
Between proponents of basic income and other people who defend something, like the perspective of what's called like universal basic services, where the idea is rather than just giving everyone a check, shouldn't we be substantively providing for sort of for the like substantive needs people have, like housing, like healthcare, like education. And I think in certain aspects that's like clearly correct. And particularly because there is this sort of right libertarian version of basic income, which sees it specifically as not a supplement or sort of a going beyond like the welfare state, but as a replacement for it and a way of undermining and destroying it. So that instead of getting universal healthcare, you just get a voucher, which in the case of something like healthcare is just like obviously manifestly, actually it's inequality in the form of equality, right? Because our substantive need for all variety of reasons of age and disability and happenstance and so many other things, our substantive need for healthcare vary. And so giving everyone the same check is actually results in an extremely unequal outcome. So I think, it's important. And I think, there's a periodic kind of like illusion that basic income proponents on the left sometimes have, that like, oh, isn't this great because it allows us to have this sort of like right left alliance that can like unite around this. And it's like, no, because that doesn't work, because fundamentally what right-wing proponents of basic income see in it and what they want it to do is fundamentally different than what
he's right. We cannot have an alliance with these people. He is 100% correct about that.
It's a way to sort of break down what's left of the welfare state rather than to supplement it. It's a way of sort of like stabilizing a particular kind of precarious capitalist wage labor rather than giving.
I just saw your article in an interview on Fox. Oh God, that's like back a couple of years. Am I still a Democrat? No, I'm a libertarian. I am not a Republican. I'm not a conservative. I never have been, and I never will be. I'm a libertarian now. But thank you for asking instead of just assuming.
People the freedom to move beyond it. That comes up even in something as just sort of like basic and quantitative as like, what is the level of the basic income? Because if it's true, like, the definition of universal basic income, the basic is supposed to mean like, however you define this, it provides for your basic needs, meaning that you can survive on it without working. But as soon as you get that basic income down to a low enough level that people cannot survive just on it, then it just becomes a subsidy to low wage labor. You're just subsidizing low wage employers because people are still having to work, but you can pay them less because they have this other supplement. So yeah, I think for all of that, I still think there is no substitute for basic income as a demand and as a concept. But I think as it's become more mainstreamed, we've seen all of these pitfalls and limitations a little bit more clearly. So we have to be, and I also, as an aside, I would love to never again see another story about someplace doing a pilot program of basic income, which is neither universal nor basic, and because it's some sort of like means tested thing for fucking $100 a month or something.
I mean, okay, so we need to give credit where credit is due, because he just called out places like, what is it? It's not, is it like Oakland, California? I think it's Oakland. So there's a city, and it's in the Bay Area, where they are actually doing a test for universal basic income, but they're doing it for like trans people or something like that. So it's like black trans people. I'm going to horribly butcher this because I haven't thought about or looked at the story in a while. They were doing a pilot for universal basic income for like black trans people or something like that. And he's basically like, no, don't do that shit. Universal means universal for everyone. Do you know why he's saying that? Do you guys have any guess why he is basically saying if you're going to do universal basic income, you have to include everyone, not just like black trans people or something like that? Why might that be a concern for him? Any guesses? Hint, it's purely selfish. He wants it too. He's a white man. I don't know if he's straight, gay, whatever, but he is a white man. And so if we're doing a pilot where only certain groups are getting universal basic income, you know what's going to be at the very bottom of the list? White men. And so he's like, I want my universal basic income too.
Something. So, there's mainstream presence has its downsides in that regard. But yeah, that's sort of my answers. And for all that, I'm still not willing to sort of let go of it as something to demand and to talk about.
So also in this communistic future, we see that there is a type of equality, but you're actually very clear that this is not a full, that hierarchies do still exist. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of equality you think is possible through these sort of like political changes? And
isn't that funny? Isn't that funny that Peter, the creator of the socialist vision of the future, is saying that hierarchies are still going to exist under socialism? It's almost like they're saying all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. It's almost like they're saying that we aren't actually getting rid of the class struggle. There's still going to be a class struggle. We're just going to be the ones on top. I have to give Peter credit for saying the quiet part out loud, at least.
What kind of hierarchies might kind of persist post-capitalism, even in the most optimistic version of it?
Yeah, so what I was trying to do there, I mean, part of what led me down that direction of talking about sort of the types of hierarchies that persist or that develop in a post-scarcity society, it was in response to sort of a reaction, the surprising reaction that I got when I was talking about these ideas in the process of writing the book, with people who would be like, well, wouldn't this communist future where we have replicators to provide for ourselves and we don't have to work for anybody for wages, wouldn't this just be boring? Wouldn't it take a sort of like conflict and like struggle out of life? And I found that a strange objection. Like, feel like I have faith in people finding fulfilling things to do with their lives, but it did make me think about how to present this in a way, because utopias are harder to write than dystopias for this reason, that they can be boring, and so I was trying to dig in to, where are the sort of sources of conflict even in a sort of a post-capitalist, post-scarcity society. So, I rely on Cory Doctorow's book, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which takes place in a sort of post-scarcity society where a crew of people are coming together to run what used to be Disneyland, and the thing I wanted to get into in this question of like hierarchy and equality is that when I'm talking about overcoming hierarchy, I'm talking about the sort of big master key social hierarchy that shapes the entire society and that you cannot opt out of. So like in a pre-capitalist society, that might have to do with, kings and landowning nobles and, peasants who are tied to them. In capitalism, of course, it's all filtered through the cash nexus, through money, that who has money, who has access to money is what determines the hierarchy. And even to the extent that there are sort of status hierarchies and of other kinds that are not directly monetary.
Who has access to the money forms the hierarchy. Gee, you don't say, Peter. You don't say.
It ultimately comes down to translating all of it into and out of money. And so what I wanted to think about was like, it's very different to think about these hierarchies if they can be opted out of, and they are these sort of more, postmodern or post-structuralist kind of like fragmentary hierarchies that, they're specific to a kind of a voluntary affinity group or something, rather than something like the need to make money to survive, or even things that appear more sort of fragmentary, or like, the bourgeois nuclear family, which also cannot exist without both the sort of the state and the market being such that it is reproduced, and that it is sort of backstopped, as we see now with sort of the homophobic attacks on trans people, on reproductive rights, and so on. So all of those were the hierarchies that I had my mind set on. That's the distinction I want to make, is that it's possible to have a society without those big master hierarchies. The sort of like the metaphor I used at one point was of like a magnet that has, you do the experiment where you put a magnet on the table and dump iron filings on it. They make the shape of the magnetic field. The iron filings are drawn into that shape of the magnet, and capitalism is a magnet like that, with capital at one end and labor on the other. And even if not everything in the society perfectly aligns with that magnetic field, it's all drawn into that sort of master polarity. Versus like, if you're in a crew of people in a post-scarcity society trying to run a theme park, you might you might find yourself being sort of on the outs with the group running it. You might find yourself, for a variety of good or bad reasons, sort of at the wrong end of a status hierarchy. But worst case scenario, you have the material ability to walk away. There's this sort of, it's like
you have that right now. You have that right now. Every single person has the ability to leave a job they don't like right now. You can always find another job. Always. Now is the very best time in human history to be able to find a job, at least in the United States. I won't speak for elsewhere, because the pandemic required so many places to go remote, and a lot of those places are still remote. So you don't even have to live in a place where there's a plethora of businesses to get a good job, because you can just go get a remote job somewhere. Nothing is ever holding you to a specific job except for you. Your refusal to look for another job, your refusal to update your resume, your refusal to apply to jobs. I have seen this over and over and over and over and over again. I used to, like, very early on in my coaching career, I would coach a lot of people who were looking for a new job for some reason. And coaching people on how to find a job is not actually my favorite thing to do, but I know how to do it really well. And I'll tell you what, the number of excuses that I heard from people who quite literally hired me to coach them, to tell them how to get a new job, the number of excuses that I heard about why they didn't want to do the things that I was telling them to do. I don't want to update my resume. I don't want to apply for those jobs. I don't know what to do. I don't want to ask for that salary. Like my job in that type of coaching was basically to get people to do the thing that they claimed they wanted to do. You can always find another job. It might suck applying for them. It might suck to go out on interviews, but guess what? That's what being an adult looks like. So don't tell me that in this socialist utopia, if you find yourself on the outs with the group that you work with, you're going to have this newfound freedom to walk away. You have always had that freedom. You can always leave. Yes, this is 100% true. My cousin did coaching years ago and quit because people don't listen. 100% true. Most of the people, and I am not cheap to hire as a coach, by the way. I'm not cheap to hire at all. We're talking like thousands of dollars a month to hire me as a private coach. And people still don't fucking listen. And it's like, I am showing you the roadmap of things that you need to do. And you're like, I don't want to. It's like, well, I'm not going to do it for you, bro. But some people do. Sometimes people do. And I got to tell you, it's like the most fulfilling thing in the world when you are a coach for people and they actually listen to you and then they actually get results. It's amazing. But you can always get another job, and don't listen to anyone who tells you that you can't get another job.
It's Albert Hirschman, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. If you have, the key is that you have through some combination of having a voice in what's happening and having the ability to exit from it, that you have some degree of freedom in that scenario, which doesn't mean that it's always going to be it's not going to be the greatest experience for everyone all the time, but it is different from the world that the hierarchies that you can't opt out of, essentially.
Okay, so moving to your second future. And also I will it was just put in the chat, but just a reminder, please share your questions. If you have any, you can drop them in at any time, and we'll start moving through them in about 10 or so minutes. So yes. So let's talk about your second vision of a future, your second future, which is rentism, and seems to be related to what your sort of new project. And it's, I think, especially prescient of all of the sort of visions that you have of the future. It looks at new ways of holding property that come through IP law, and you have some discussion of Bitcoin, considering, like, especially, I guess, the past few weeks, the news around crypto collapses, and also in the intervening time,
what does he think of Bitcoin, I wonder?
NFTs became a thing between this book being
NFTs are such a scam.
Could you talk about how rentism, as you defined it, is more or less prominent today, and also why these things are sort of prone to collapse, and how that might sort of affect the rentist future?
Yeah, so the grounding, so here we're rentism, where this is the sort of the anti-Star Trek concept, is how do you preserve class relations, capitalist-like class relations in an environment where material scarcity can be overcome. And the grounding insight here for me is that property, private property, excludable property that someone can claim ownership of and exclude other people from, is a creature of the state, is a creature of law. It's not a thing that sort of naturally exists, right?
Excuse me. Now, this is no surprise, right? Communists want to abolish private property. This is in the Communist Manifesto. It is not a surprise that he wants to abolish private property. But to say private property is a tool of the state? Private property is not natural? I'm sorry, what? Is this like a Brave New World, like everyone belongs to everyone else sort of thing, and like everyone's property is your property? That is the natural way of being. Trendlin, you're not a landlord anymore. Your rental property belongs to me. Congratulations.
Right, and that's not just true of like the digital world, where copyright makes it so that it's illegal to copy things that could otherwise be copied for free. But it goes back to the beginnings of capitalism, to the enclosures, to taking common lands that were shared by people and were not treated as anybody's private property, literally putting fences around them and saying, now this is owned by some.
Hang on, I want to show this from Tristram, an observation from watching these over and over again. All of these individuals seem to literally only produce media to sell, books, interview, etc., and/or be in education. That's a really interesting observation. I think that you're correct about that. I think that you're right. So they believe in intellectual property on some level because they're selling their intellectual property when they're selling their books. But not actual private property. That is but a step too far.
Somebody, and there has to be a state that enforces that, or some other power
exactly
that enforces that, for that enclosure to happen, for it to be real, for someone to get away with it, essentially. And it's that, and so what you see now is that as more and more of the economy is sort of like the immaterial or the digital, or things that can be copied almost for free, whether it's music files or it's books, digital books, or it's whatever. This sort of opens the door to some post-scarcity options, but then it also is very threatening, obviously, to people whose entire vision of how society and economy is supposed to work is that you have excludable property that you can make people pay for. And so what's interesting, I think, about like the crypto thing particularly, like, I mean, I could go on a whole other tangent about crypto because it has different dimensions, and it's like such a creature of the 2008 crisis itself, that it makes like a very
he hates
sort
crypto.
Of a good guidepost for a lot of this stuff.
He hates
but
it.
with the stuff like NFTs, for example, particularly, you look at the people promoting that stuff, the NFTs or Web3, which was this sort of fake new version of the internet that they were trying to claim would be done with crypto in the last year or two. All of it, you read the people who are promoting it, the people who are making the case for it will be talking about this as a way of creating digital scarcity, artificial scarcity. And they believe that that's a good thing because they believe that, they want the basis of society and therefore the basis of power and wealth to be what can you own that you can then charge other people the right to access. Now, in terms of what crypto ended up doing and why it ended up being just this thing that's just prone to sort of speculative bubbles and collapses, is that there was, I think, well, in the beginning, I think a sort of an honest belief, at least among some factions in originating this stuff, that you could essentially create scarcity without the hand of the state there to enforce it, right? So one of the Bitcoiner slogans or the crypto people slogans is code is law, right? That if you code this thing correctly and you use the cryptographic, mechanisms that are used in sort of crypto tokens and Ethereum.
What did he say to offend you, Hero?
You can enforce this
Tell me more.
artificial scarcity of digital tokens without some external, without a state or without any external force to do so. But this runs up against the problem that all of these things, like, they're not actually money. You can't actually really do anything with them that's external to the crypto sphere itself. And so
sure
to
you
the
can.
extent that code is law, it's only law within the sort of playground of crypto itself. And so what I think you saw happen.
What are you talking about?
50...
I can go buy stuff with crypto. How is that theoretical? I can go buy stuff with crypto right now. I can buy pizza with crypto. I can buy groceries with crypto. This is not theoretical.
Years of crypto's development is I think gradually the true believers, the cypherpunks, the people who really believed in the sort of code is law and believed in the blockchain as like a technology were gradually displaced by more and more like garden variety scammers, like people whose vocation is scamming and just found crypto to be the latest speculative scam to get in on. So there are people who come from literally the message boards where get rich quick scammers get together to talk about their schemes. They migrate into Bitcoin. People who used to be running,
some of those people did get rich on
where,
Bitcoin.
The VIPs could look at other players' cards, migrated into running Bitcoin exchanges. Like, that's literally who the chief legal counsel of FTX, the exchange that just collapsed, his background was in working for a crooked poker site. And I think that's because ultimately people realized that, like, the claims for what it could do, were based on a delusion about property independent of the state and independent of some like social force that gives it meaning.
I agree. If you guys haven't checked out Goldbacks, check out Goldbacks. They're so pretty. They have these great designs and they are actual gold that you can carry around. My husband loves Goldbacks. New Hampshire is one of the most crypto-friendly states anywhere. There are so many crypto millionaires here. It's like it is crazy. And they do take crypto in a lot of the stores, and they do take Goldbacks in a lot of the stores. Not everywhere, but in a lot of them. In enough where there are people in New Hampshire who live 100% on crypto. I'm not saying I'm going to do it because I'm not that into crypto. I know enough to be dangerous, and when the crypto people tell me something, like, I'm more prone to listen to them because they really think it out. But
and so then it just became, Beanie Babies or 90s baseball cards or whatever kind of like speculative asset class you want to take. And it's, and which is not to sort of diminish the fact that I do think that like a lot of our era's kind of scam technologies, it was sort of a false.
Hang on. No, a lot of people take crypto at PorcFest. And I mean, there is internet at PorcFest. There absolutely is. But a lot of people do. You can buy really good pizza with crypto at PorcFest, like really good pizza.
Solution to a real need, right? Like, it's not coincidental that this stuff starts. Bitcoin is released in 2008, and it makes the original Genesis block of Bitcoin makes reference directly to the financial crisis and the bank bailouts. That, like, instead of some kind of change to the financial system that would bail out ordinary people rather than banks. We didn't get that. Obama bailed out the banks. He didn't bail out us. What we got instead, it was crypto. And I feel like that makes it that's one of the reasons I feel like it makes such a good kind of guide to the whole vibe of post 2008 capitalism.
So like, it's not the best internet in the world, to be honest, but there is internet at PorcFest, and you can actually get on. They have like an internet plan at PorcFest where like you can connect to their like Wi-Fi or whatever. I've never had a problem getting online at PorcFest. I've never had a problem using crypto at PorcFest. But that's not to say it's perfect. Yes, Brian, we can see you.
Okay, great. Moving, so I want to, maybe we'll come back to more crypto.
This woman has no idea what he's talking about. She has no idea at all.
Talk a little bit about that.
I still don't understand what rentism is.
Which is your vision of
what is everyone's understanding of what rentism is? Because to me it kind of sounded like it's like socialism, but private property still exists or something like that. I did live stream last year. I live streamed a whole stream at PorcFest where I was just blocking like thousands of conservatives on Twitter because they were being assholes. And so I was like blocking them all on a live stream. Yeah, I don't think he ever actually said what rentism is. Rentism is the opposite to excessive profits being made. The word itself is a reference to the renter-leaser relationship. But like, what does it mean? I still don't understand what it means. The rentist scenario reveals economic rents return on use of owned property rather than labor as the dominant source of surplus. Bot, this is suspiciously proper for you, Bot. So are you putting a definition in from somewhere? Because this is not the bot we know. This makes sense though. The rentist scenario involves economic rents, so so it is private property rather than labor as the source of I think rentism is talking about anything where you get monetary gain by lending out assets. That makes sense. Okay.
Socialism, which is a combination of equality and scarcity. And it's also the chapter in which you really sort of talk about the climate crisis most sort of explicitly, and that's sort of what you take up and are sort of dealing with. And so can you talk a little bit about what the sort of vision of the like resolution seems the wrong word, the sort of what kind of comes out of an equality and scarcity combination, and also where you see some of the hope for the future in terms of mitigating climate collapse.
Right. So this is the world where, like, right, in the sort of communism future, I've sort of wished away, like, I've sort of fictional technologied my way into, okay, we found a way to basically stabilize the climate to such a degree that we can sort of live in the Star Trek world without having to worry about that too much. Now, in this chapter where I'm coming back and saying, okay, we know that really, it's even more clear now than it was when I wrote it, that, the climate change is happening now, that like things are underway that we're not going to be able to reverse in the near term. There's going to have to, even if we can decarbonize much more rapidly than we are, a lot of the damage has been done. There's going to be dislocations. There's going to be, people are going to have to move. There's going to be huge effects on agriculture. Places are going to be underwater and so on. And so then the question just becomes what, if you filter that through, a kind of a capitalist class structure, you get sort of the future will end on that, where the human cost of that is just sort of paid by the people that can't afford to get away from it. But if you imagine a more egalitarian future, then we try to think about how do we sort of live in this world together, in a world where even if we have the technology that can still make life a lot easier by automating a lot of things, what do we do to sort of, how can we come together in a process of sort of like ecological reconstruction? That means changing both, sort of rebuilding the way we live as people in a way that is, that is sort of consistent with maintaining the Earth's capacities to support us, and to some extent, cleaning up the damage that's been done, right? That ultimately, if that's much of the work of the future, is the sort of process of cleaning up the damage, and of sort of building a world that that we all want to live in, which is, I think even if.
Can anyone think of a dystopian reality? This is kind of a trick question. I want you guys to be careful about this. Can anyone think of a dystopian story that is a very, very, very popular dystopian story that has been made into movies and TV shows that exists in popular culture? So this is a story that every single person is probably familiar with on some level. Can anyone think of a dystopian reality in which one of the primary things that they came together to do once they gained control of the state apparatus was to clean up the environment and the damage that had been done to the environment through the things that Peter is talking about? No, not the Hunger Games. I mean, these may be true, but they're not the ones I'm thinking of. Not Lord of the Rings, no. Like, this was a very prominent part of the story, was cleaning up the environmental damage. Nope. 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 I'm going to give you a hint. The colonies. The colonies. One of you is going to get it. The colonies. Well, Soylent Green had this theme too. Stephanie's getting closer. Soylent Green absolutely had this theme. It's not the one I'm thinking of, but Soylent Green is like the closest guess so far. That's a really, really good guess. Very, very popular dystopian society in which, when they gained control of the state, one of the things they endeavored to do was to send people to the colonies, sending undesirables to the colonies to force them to clean up the environment. I can't believe someone doesn't know this. The Handmaid's Tale. This is The Handmaid's Tale. They did this. It's not like the most prominent part of the book or the TV show or the movie, to be quite frank. It's not. I don't know if it's in the movie at all. I think it might be alluded to in the movie. But in The Handmaid's Tale, they had colonies where they sent all the undesirable women to the colonies to basically make them pick up toxic waste and sludge forever until their skin was melting off their faces and they got really sick and died. You guys need to read the fucking Handmaid's Tale. You need to watch it. Watch the Hulu show. Okay, it only covers, like, the book version only covers, like, the first season. God, I can't believe no one knew that. Handmaid's Tale is a really good book, guys. I know a lot of you don't like it because you've been accused of being Handmaid's Tale people by, like, the left, but, like, it is legitimately a really, really good book that everyone should read.
If we take seriously and take the sort of worst case scenario seriously of where we're already headed, I believe it is still possible for us to imagine, a decent future for ourselves and for future generations. It's not going to be obviously one that consumes, burns as much carbon as the society we live in now. It's going to mean probably, travel is going to have to change. Sort of what and how we consume is going to have to change. The ways that we sort of organize living and with each other and caring for each other is going to have to change. But that, like, ultimately, the idea that producing more and more, consuming more and more energy, spewing more and more pollution is the only path to sort of human flourishing and prosperity is a capitalist idea, and one that I wanted to sort of break away from and say it's not either we sort of find a magical fix for the climate crisis and sort of live happily ever after, or we're just doomed to eternal misery. that there is a way to conceive of a social structure in which, there's sort of trade-offs and there's sacrifices and there's big shifts that have to be made in the way that we live, but that doesn't have to mean sort of large scale.
There's trade-offs and sacrifices to the way that we live. So there's another line in The Handmaid's Tale. You guys need to read the fucking Handmaid's Tale. There's another line in The Handmaid's Tale in which one of the captains, which is like the governing body of their dystopian society, he says, better doesn't always mean better for everyone. It means better for some, but it means worse for others. So better, like when these people are talking about, oh, it's going to create a better society, it's going to create a better world. Better doesn't mean better for everyone. It will always be worse for some.
Suffering, which is what it could and will mean under other sets of social relations.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask one more question and then we're going to move.
It is not garbage. It's really good.
So the final question is on the final future, which you just referenced, the fourth future, which is exterminism, which is hierarchy and scarcity. In that chapter, the example is a Matt Damon movie called Elysium, which I actually haven't seen, but in which the very rich are sort of completely sheltered away from the rest of the population and have basically eternal life and a wonderful existence, and everyone else is doing pretty badly. And to be honest, reading it, it felt maybe more than it did in 2016, like that we might be in an exterminist present already, that maybe has been any sort of those tensions have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and maybe in particular. But do you think that this is a sort of a likely future? Do you see this in the present? What sort of what's your read on how sort of true to life that is?
I mean, the thing that's sort of darkly funny to me about this part is that when I first was writing this and when the book came out, I got a lot more reactions of sort of like, overall it's a cool book, cool ideas, but like this chapter in particular, it seems like a little like over the top in its sort of dystopian darkness. And now more likely I'm going to get the reaction of like, oh yeah, this is the one that's going to happen or is happening. And I mean, I think, yeah, it's sort of related to what we talked about at the very beginning, that like where the techno fixes for our social crisis are not coming. And so instead what we're getting is increasingly a ruling class that wants to find a way to hide and a way to protect itself. I mean, I'll say, to get to another Star Trek theme, to DS9, which you have right behind you, there's an episode of Deep Space Nine.
Hang on. Then you don't really care about this stuff. If you just can't read The Handmaid's Tale because someone on the left says nice things about it, then you're not a serious person. I'm going to give you some tough love here. This attitude is why these people are winning. This attitude right here is why these people are kicking your ass 19 ways from Sunday. Because you just can't be bothered because of your fragile. Are you fragile, Stephen? Do you see Don Lemon everywhere? Does he hurt your fragile feels? I'm picking on you a little bit because I'm trying to make the point that this is not a reasonable answer. This is the answer you give when you want to lose to people like him. All right. He's saying it wasn't a serious comment. He's just having a bit of fun. All right. I take it back, Steven. I take it back. But you got to understand, like, I get people making comments like that all the time. And so if I'm a little trigger happy, if it triggered me a little bit, it might have triggered me just because I have to hear stuff like that like all the goddamn time. And I'm like, this is why we're losing. This is why we're fucking losing. Because people can't be bothered. And so I apologize for picking on you. I hope you're a good sport about it. But watch the TV show, man. Watch the Hulu show. The Hulu show's actually really good. There's a great soundtrack, great music. It's entertaining. It's just slightly woke, just a little bit. But it's really good. It's a good show.
Where the crew is transported to 21st century San Francisco.
Fuck you, bot.
Where in the year 2024, where people are, the poor are basically being warehoused in sanctuary cities, which are basically like concentration camps. And there's like a riot that happens there. The Bell riots, which are big in the Star Trek lore, then one of the things that's supposed to kind of catalyze the transition from like our hell world to the Star Trek future. And as it turns out, in the year 2022, you know, warehousing the homeless and the mentally ill in camps is in fact a bipartisan project of politicians throughout the country, including in San Francisco. So we are right on track for the Bell riots in 2024. The only sort of the only thing I can say optimistically on that is that fortunately, the ruling class is quite deluded about how much they can actually completely hide away from the rest of us. You know,
really?
they may believe that they.
What are you gonna do?
Like, they have these fantasies of like setting up libertarian utopias on oil rigs in the ocean, or like hiding on a private island somewhere. But like, actually, their lives do still rely on the labor of millions of people. And
so he thinks that the ruling class are all libertarians? Okay. Nick says, Miss K, trigger happy pew pew, LOL. I mean, listen, man, I get enough shit like that in my chat where I think I have earned my right to be trigger happy. I mean, you're telling me that if this guy had a chance to move to his own private island and not be bothered by anyone, he wouldn't do it? Yeah, exactly. Exactly, Stephanie. I think that sounds actually like a pretty good idea. That's my version of utopia.
So like those things, sort of like the crypto fantasy of escaping from the state, like the seasteaders and all of it. It's like that at that level, it's fantastical. It's not gonna, as much as they might like to just sort of like hide in their castles from us, they can't really. But that doesn't mean that they can't have.
There are like crypto millionaires in New Hampshire who have really huge properties and are like pretty much just like can be left alone to do what they want to do. So I don't think it's fantastical. It is actually real life.
Have an increasingly violent, increasingly militarized, increasingly carceral society in which the consequences of extreme inequalities of wealth and extreme inequality, and extreme levels of misery among the population are simply addressed by liberals and conservatives.
What did you think of it, Kate?
By increased repression. I think that's sort of where we are.
Okay, we're going to move on to audience questions. If you're in the audience and you've been sitting on a question, please share it.
Has he actually defined any of? I feel like I actually we've now been watching this for 45 minutes, and I know we've been talking about other stuff in the chat, but like I truly have no sense of what he believes life after capitalism looks like. He basically just kept describing these realities in which there's still class hierarchy. There's still private property. There's still all these things that he doesn't like. Like, am I wrong that he had 4 different scenarios and he didn't define any of them? I'm not looking at that DM right now, bot. Like, he really didn't, right? And I feel like I can understand this stuff like more than the average bear because I've been listening to so much of it, but like, no, it seems as though everyone in the chat agrees with me. Excellent. Maybe he'll define some stuff in the Q&A.
First, we're going to hear from Greg, who asks a question that I'm also very curious about.
Oh, yeah, that's right, Kristen. Star Trek.
In recent years, arguing that humanity can't really deal with climate change unless degrowth is implemented. Have you looked into this? And if so, do you have any comments about degrowth?
It's a complicated one. So degrowth is, the way this is generally put, I guess, as the way I see it sort of portrayed often in these left debates, is that degrowth is pitched against some sort of like, there's like on the one side you have this sort of like Promethean version of like we can just grow our way out of the problems, that if we have enough economic growth and enough incentives for technological development, we'll find ways to overcome the limits imposed by the ecological crisis, versus degrowth as we need to, you know,
Passionberry,
live simpler,
tasty.
less energy intensive sort of lives. Insofar as it's at that level of generality, I'm sort of, I guess, pro degrowth. I think often the degrowth kind of advocates, I mean, there's various people who use that term and mean different things by it, and there's a large body of writing that I'm certainly not expert in. I think what tends to happen in the more sort of public-facing debates is that the whole terminology just gets us confused and gets us into a place that I think from like a sort of a social theoretical perspective and a left perspective is not very helpful, because again, growth as an abstraction is itself kind of inherently a capitalist concept. It's you know, to use another
growth is a capitalist concept.
Common line joke people make about crypto, it's number go up is the idea here, right? That like in capitalism, growth is just like if the number goes up, if more capital is accumulating, more money is accumulating, the stock market is going up, that's growth and that's good. But that's a layer of abstraction placed over this whole world of what substantively is growing or shrinking, right? That like carbon emissions are growing, you know, access to, you know, public education is shrinking, right? That there's like actual substantive.
I haven't missed that point at all, Stephen. In fact, I've said it repeatedly in this stream.
Human things going on here and physical things going on here that, like, you know, I think we need to, that those are what we need to be talking about. And it is often what the degrowthers are talking about. But I think once it gets pitched at the level of like, you know, growth, yes or no, that we're already sort of stuck in some sort of bourgeois ideology that is not helpful to us.
Bourgeois. Okay, pop quiz. Hang on. We're going to see if people have been paying attention, because I said this earlier in the stream too. Some people are paying attention, some aren't. What are other words for bourgeois? Give me some other words for bourgeois in the chat. When he says bourgeois, what does he mean? No, not workerson. Proletariat is worker. White, exactly. Capitalist, owners, whiteness, white. You don't have to shut up, Stephen, but I'm gonna correct things when things are wrong. This is a teaching stream. It's just how it goes, man. I'm a teacher. This isn't just like this is like, we're doing serious work here, bro. You're welcome to stay. We want you to stay. We want you to hang out. Okay, elite, imperialist, landowner, capitalism. Exactly. Property owners, elite, landowners, elite, privileged, new rich, rich white folks, whiteness, capitalism. If you own a car, yup. No, not exactly. No, you can have more stuff than him and still be proletariat. It is a really specific thing. Owning private property, landowner. Not necessarily the middle class. Not necessarily. Sometimes. Capitalist. Yep. You guys got it. Exactly. Thank you for playing along.
Our next audience question is from Josh, who says, please discuss what role, if any, debt plays in these futures.
Well, I mean, it's crucial to something like the rentist future, because it's a way, like it's another way to keep people locked into the sort of monetary system, right? When if like you know, debt is ultimately another relation that has to be enforced by the state. So
Good one.
It requires the sort of social hierarchy to enforce it. But it's a way of saying like, forcing you to engage with the monetized capitalist systems, to find ways to make money. So if you even if people
Levity's
potentially
cool,
have
Steven.
access
We're cool.
to whatever,
it's all
a
good.
replicator that could like make their food for them, if you then also load them up with a debt and says you have to find a way to repay this debt or we can lock you up, then that forces you to engage with the economy of what can I get someone to pay me to do, which is the key to something like the rentist society, where otherwise there's not a clear, there's no longer the sense of necessarily you will starve if you don't get somebody to pay you a wage. So it's how do we maintain this system of forcing people to work for wages, and debt is crucial to doing that. I mean, as it has been in the recent history of capitalism, right? That like the part of the disciplining of the working class is in rich countries.
Leave them alone, Zane. We're all learning
debt,
here.
You know,
we're all
debt
learning,
especially, but also other kinds of debt that make it more.
Thank you, Brandon.
Make it more difficult to resist the system in any way, because ultimately, yeah, it's a mechanism by which you can be punished.
It's a fair question. It is an extremely fair question.
And he asks, I wonder what the place of identity is in these futures: race, nation, civic identities, etc. Do you see these as superficial byproducts of the class system, or as systems whose legacies will preoccupy and figure into these futures?
I mean, I certainly, you know, I think that, again, this is one of those things that I could, you know, I just sort of made a choice to sort of put on a back burner when I was constructing this particular argument. I think, you know, clearly, I think the history of humanity would suggest that all of these sort of like identities, you know, of various kinds, national identities, religious identities, other kinds of identities, race, are things that, you know, they don't just sort of like turn on and off like a switch, but they are lived in the context of social relations, right? Like I don't, you know, I think it's, you can't like racism is not merely a product of capitalism in some abstract sense, but also the particular way that race manifests itself in a capitalist society is specific to it. And so what would happen to all those identities, where they would go, how they would change, how people would have the sort of freedom or the desire to sort of muddy them in a society, in an environment in which those things were not directly tied back to capital accumulation, is, I think, an interesting thing to think about. And like, you know, there is good sort of science fiction that goes sort of in that direction more. Because it's, again, it's, to use the metaphor I used earlier, it's like it's taking out the magnet of the capital relation, and everything looks different. It doesn't mean all these other sort of like ways of establishing social identities or social hierarchies disappear, but they're no longer all being drawn into that magnetic field where your position in a racial hierarchy is also what determines your position in an economic hierarchy.
What the fuck is he saying? That's an honest question. I have no idea. Is everyone else a little bit lost? Does anyone have any idea what he just said? He does seem to be really close to saying the word justice. I know everyone's like hungering for that bingo word. I don't know what he's saying right now. Hero Blast said, he just said individuality is earned by money. Okay. He wants everyone to be the same with no identity. Well, that makes sense. He is. He is the salad cheese. He's waffling around systemic racism. I think that's correct. He's saying that being a race is convoluted by your status. So he's saying that the class struggle convolutes the race struggle. This guy is like next level word salad, man. Stephanie's the adult in the room. So he basically is just basing all his ideas on Roddenberry's universe, a world where there are no countries, no hunger, no want, but no actual details on how. Well, that describes pretty much every socialist we watch. All right.
Right, or your position in a gender hierarchy determines your position in an economic hierarchy, right? You take out that sort of structuring relationship, and then all of these things, I think, will, you know, even more so than they already do today, we'll be sort of the subject of refashioning and reimagining and experimentation with different ways of ultimately of imagining our social world with each other, which is what all this stuff, I think, is ultimately about.
Okay, great. I just do want to encourage audience members, if you have more questions, we're looking for questions, not comments. You can reformat your comment to be a question if you already put it in. So we're going to move on to another question from Greg, which is, have you looked much at anarchism to see if our governmental structures might possibly move in that direction, including what's happening with the roughly 3 million people in Rojava, Northeast Syria, who are living under a sort of anarchism? Any thoughts in this regard?
I mean, I guess I'm sort of, well, there's many kinds of anarchism, obviously. The kind that I find most interesting is one where, especially when you're doing the sort of speculative exercise that we've been talking about here, there's not a clear distinction to me between communism and anarchism. Right? Like, Marx is clear that like the state.
There's not a clear distinction between communism and anarchism? Let's rewind. Let's relive that moment just one more time. We have to. It was great.
There's many kinds of anarchism, obviously. The kind that I find most interesting is one where, especially when you're doing the sort of speculative exercise that we've been talking about here, there's not a clear distinction to me between communism and anarchism.
Wrong.
Right? Like Marx is clear that like the state ultimately is a function of class society. And there's of course the cliches about the state withering away and this, and we can debate how well that's rooted in Marx's writing and so on. But I do tend to think that, like, again, one of the reasons that I could have called the axis of equality and hierarchy in the book the class axis. I could have just said it was sort of capital versus labor. And I didn't do that because I wanted to sort of get at this idea that we are trying to break down the idea of any single structuring hierarchy that everybody is forced into, with some people placed at the top, right? And so to the extent that things like Rojava, these, or we talk about this, we used to talk about the Zapatistas, that these experiments are taking seriously that idea of breaking down any kind of central structuring hierarchy as part of the project of getting out of capitalism. I think that's sort of...
You think that communism is breaking down any central structure and hierarchy? Where did I find this class? The University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League. You think there's no hierarchy in communism? Oh my God. Tell that to Xi Jinping. Tell that to North Korea. I just fucking can't.
That's sort of essential. I mean, I take some anarchism with my Marxism always, and as an aside, I think we can, as Marxists, we can go back to using that terminology. There was a time, I think, when people thought of like libertarian socialism or something like that.
That's not a real thing.
Like as a euphemism that didn't sound as sketchy as anarchism, but like now
there is no such thing as libertarian socialism, a founding tenet of libertarianism. Kurt, I'm glad you're still here. Like, did you hear that, Kurt? I was like, Kurt's gonna jump out of his fucking chair. Like, a central tenet of libertarianism is fucking private property. If you get rid of private property, it is not libertarian. There is no such thing as libertarian socialism. I don't care what Bosch fucking says. It is not a real thing. I don't care what this guy says. I don't care what Jacobin Magazine says. It is not a real fucking thing. Those are two diametrically opposed ideas. Kurt, did you hear him say that communism and anarchism is the same thing? Oh my God, that was so great.
Now, libertarianism associates with things that are so much worse than even the dumbest forms of anarchism that we can just go back to being sympathetic to anarchism.
Okay, I'm gonna ask one of my questions. So as something of an amateur scholar of zombie media, it seems like we're like exclusively inundated with post-apocalyptic visions of exterminism, not any of the other kinds of futures in mainstream pop culture in particular, with very few exceptions. I would say that the Star Treks are one of them. Why is this? do you think? And what are some non-exterminist future forward books or movies that you could kind of recommend to anyone who's sort of thinking in the future, but trying to imagine a maybe more optimistic or less nihilistic, at least, version of the future?
Yeah, I mean, so part of the problem comes to something I mentioned earlier, which is that people find it harder to make utopias not boring, right? That it's easier to find conflict in a sort of a story that's based on brutality and oppression and scarcity. And so, and like it works in Star Trek to the extent that it keeps its stakes low enough to make this feel like an interesting world, but also one that's basically good to live in, right? Like Star Trek: The Next Generation works because it's like a workplace drama a lot of the time, where they also happen to meet aliens and like time travel. So I think that's it's a big part of it, and in addition to just the fact that I think just there's something dystopia when you just like take it by itself is the more reactionary and the more sort of like friendly to the interests of the people that fund like certainly big TV and movie science fiction. Like there's something people can sort of take comfort in the idea that it's like everything is dystopian and we're all screwed, and that right, and that there's nothing that can be done about it, and that sort of suits the ruling class just fine. In terms of there are people who are better versed in sort of the modern what's going on right now in science fiction, who probably have better ideas than me. But just to think about some of the classics, right, like, and to shout out somebody that really should have played probably more of a role in the book than she did, Ursula Le Guin would be somebody who obviously writes about there are dystopian aspects to the stories that he writes, but in things like The Dispossessed, or even The Left Hand of Darkness, or Always Coming Home, there's thinking through both in terms of a sort of a degrowth concept of what a good but not sort of Promethean like endless growth focused society would look like, as well as how gender and sexuality could operate and could change in those environments. I mean, that's always going to be a classic, or what I do use in the book, of course, Kim Stanley Robinson, the Mars trilogy most famously, but more recently things like New York 2140 that tries to like move things, look at sort of like dealing with climate change mitigation in a way that is not totally dystopian. There's also his more recent book, which I actually haven't read, The Ministry for the Future. And to shout out a sort of a weirder one that it's probably less well known today, but that I have a soft spot for, Ken MacLeod's books, particularly his trilogy, The Star Fraction, The Stone Canal, The Cassini Division. He's someone I would say is sort of an anarchist inflected Marxist, and I particularly like those books as a guy who's just been a socialist for many years and been around the socialist movement for a long time. That these are books that end in the far future, end in a far future post-scarcity society, but begin with like Trotskyists hanging around in Scottish pubs in the 1970s. And so like that connection between the sort of the world of our politics and the future is something that I've always loved. And so I don't know if we have I didn't see what you're referring to, Miranda, but I'll take whatever question we got.
Okay. So Daniel says, I'm agreeing with your goals, but not your assumptions. Property appears to be older than the state. So does hierarchy.
Ooh.
Emerging spontaneously in insane asylums, Goffman, and currency in the form of cigarettes and prisoner of war camps. We can even see it in primates prior to the development of Homo sapiens. I would also point out that Star Trek universe, the world goes through hell before it comes back, built back better. The Third World War begins in the 2020s, I guess, with the Bell riots, and continues to the 2050s. So what are your justifications for your assumptions, and can you sort of rationalize
what a great question,
the assumptions that the sort of like big premises that undergird this work?
Great question.
I guess the question, I'm generally kind of allergic to these kind of transhistorical assumptions about how human societies work, and I think
you don't want to answer the question about how you get your assumptions, do you?
I mean, I do think it comes down to, in some ways, like when you're talking about property, what are we really talking about, right?
Property.
If we're talking like there's the distinction can be made in a capitalist society between like personal property and like private property, meaning it's one thing to like own my clothes, you know, and my toothbrush. It's another thing to own, you know, to sort of own a business or a massive capital that is able to be deployed to earn more capital. And like, you know, land is, be able to own land and exclude others from it is, you know, that's the stuff that I'm saying. It exists in various forms, yes, in many different kinds of societies, but it is ultimately doesn't exist independent of those societies. It requires these complex institutions and social relations to actually make it so that, like, if I own some land and somebody else comes on it, you know, I can either call someone who will come and arrest them, or I can get away with shooting them or whatever. Like, that only happens within a certain matrix of social relations, and in a different matrix of social relations, it could be otherwise and is otherwise in many times.
Yeah, so exactly, Kurt. To socialists, what they own is personal property. And that's okay. You're allowed to own your clothes, you're allowed to own your books, you're allowed to, but not houses or land. You're not allowed to own houses or land. That's just a step too far. How about a car? Are you allowed to own a car, or is that too big? It's kind of like when they say in the Communist Manifesto, like, not everyone who engages in the capitalist system is actually a capitalist. They distinguish between, like, the small business owner who's just they're engaging in the capitalist system just because they need to do it in order to survive, because that's the system they're working in. So it's totally okay to, like, run a small business. That's fine. But the minute your business gets too successful, then you're part of the bourgeois and you are the enemy. So where's the line? Electric cars only, probably. Which ironically would benefit Elon Musk, which is one of the people they hate more than anything. All right, guys, this is Socialism Saturday. We do this on my channel every Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We watch real socialists try to explain their view of the world to us. This guy's doing, like, he's doing what he's doing. I don't really understand it, but okay, fine. Please mount that like button if you are enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not already. We have about 20 minutes left in this talk, so we can make it. Let's wrap up.
And places. So yeah, I think if you want to define sort of like property narrowly enough, or sort of broadly enough in a sense, or sort of like to cover as many different forms of like relationships between human beings and like the physical world, sure. But I think the role that it takes on in capitalism is bigger and it's qualitatively different. And I think we see with things like what we were talking about in the digital realm of these fights over intellectual property and so on, that there is a constant process of contesting where those boundary lines are, what we want to conceive of as property, what kind of, like, to what degree do we create social forces that enforce those distinctions and enforce those boundaries.
Okay, we have another question from Itamar, which also is a great question. I don't mean to sound too teacherly, as I do a lot of teaching, but this is actually, I think, great and hits on something that we have not talked about, which is, should there be a role in imagining species destruction, or do you consider that to such efforts to be politically regressive?
What I'm going to clarify, what do you mean by species destruction?
Itamar, if you want to drop that in, I take him to mean like the end of humanity.
Yeah.
So if that's not the case, do you drop it in the questions and we will clarify? But that's what I understand it as.
Yeah, that one, in a way, sort of like, it's sort of the obverse for me of going to Mars, in that it is sort of an unthinkable for me, and I think it's unthinkable in such a way that trying to think it leads us down some blind alleys that we don't want to go down. It's difficult. It's, unfortunately, it's now easy to imagine a future in which millions or even billions of people suffer and die as a result of the conditions that we've created on this planet. What is very difficult for me to imagine is one in which the human race literally becomes extinct, even in the worst case scenarios, right? And I think that in some ways, it's difficult for me to conceive of. And I think when we talk in those terms, often for some people, it's tempting to talk in those terms because it leads us to a way of arguing that sort of says, well, in some sense, we're all in this together, that, like, even if, like, capitalists and workers or the global North and South seem to be sort of at odds in terms of their interests in what's happening to this planet. Ultimately, we all have to live here and our survival is at stake. And unfortunately, my argument, and part of why I'm so emphasized this sort of question of class structure and social hierarchies, is that I just don't believe that. And I think that it's, I think it's sort of in a way dangerous for us to look away from the fact that insofar as the rich can find a way to hide away from us and either kill or warehouse the surplus population in order to eke out a life for themselves on this planet, that is what is going to happen, barring the sort of social revolution that prevents it. So that's why I sort of, I'd leave it aside for reasons of sort of feasibility and thinkability, and also just because in a sense it's like the sort of the black hole of social theory. With no people, there's no society, and therefore no social theory. And so, what is it to even think of that?
Okay, we have gone through audience questions. I have one more, but please jump in if you have more questions. We will be able to answer, or able to have time to answer them. So I think just jumping back to the book, and I'm going to jump to the third future, of socialism, sort of like controversially on the left, you come out saying that there are going to be markets under socialism, or that markets have a role to play. So can you discuss sort of what your vision of markets under this version of socialism, which again is a combination of equality and scarcity, and are markets kind of necessary for any scarcity inflected future?
So I don't want to say necessary exactly, but what I wanted to do with that argument was to sort of, I do come down on the side of saying that, when I think about what is sort of essential to capitalism and what is essentially unfree and oppressive about capitalism, markets are not really in the center of that. And, for me, I just mean a market is meaning just any situation in which you put a price on something, right? And that's really all it is. And that can take a lot of different forms. Now, the capitalist market has a particular character owing to, again, the fact that it's part of a master social hierarchy of capital and of money that links everything together, so that everything you want to do in this society is linked to your ability to access this form of payment, and most people can only do that by selling their labor power. But there's plenty of ways in which you can embed market-like systems, if you just have some scarce resource that you need to allocate. It can just be as simple as space. So I think I used the parking example. I've written about the parking example. I use it in the book, where it's just suppose you want to ration parking spaces, and does it make sense to, what's the most sort of given that there's a limited number of them and you have to allocate them somehow, does it make sense to allocate them through some sort of market mechanism? Well, maybe. The problems with that arise not because I think of the market mechanism being there. They arise due to the fact of how do you get the means of payment to engage in that market in the first place, right? So again, we are used to thinking of a world in which everyone enters a market as just a general capitalist market in which they have however much money they happen to have, which is dependent on their position in the capitalist class structure. Whereas you can also imagine a situation in which for some specific market, everybody gets allocated a certain number of tokens to play in that market that are allocated not based on wage labor or not based on property relations, that are based on some other political criteria. And then the market just becomes this sort of it's neither inherently good or bad kind of mechanism. It's just a mechanism. It might work, it might not, it might end up having negative consequences that we have to deal with. But I just think it's a mistake to confuse market mechanisms with the system of capitalist accumulation. The idea that capitalism is primarily about markets is itself, I think, a form of bourgeois ideology, right? That it's primarily about, I think, property relations and class relations, and markets even, play much less of a role in capitalism than capitalists would like us to think they do. And so the flip side of that is that things that look sort of like markets can still play a role even in not.
That's all word salad, right? Did he say anything of value? That seemed to be all word salad to me.
Okay, we have a question from Greg, who asks, your book was published in 2016. I think you're right. So you're now working on another book or project. are you now working on another book or project? And if so, can you give us a peek at where things are at with that?
Yeah. So where I've been going recently is to sort of take the other side of the premise of the book in a certain way, right? The premise being this sort of mass automation scenario in which, suppose we could have the Star Trek technology, suppose we could automate human labor. And I intentionally spent less time sort of motivating that than just sort of taking it as a premise, based on the idea that there are at least tendencies in capitalism that push that way, even if they may not be realized for some of the reasons we discussed earlier. So now I'm looking at what, like, increasingly to me in this post 2008 era has seemed to be really the predominance in.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing at the chat. Zane, you are king of the chat for the remainder of the stream, because Zane was like, you know who else rambles? People on cocaine. A late king of the chat designation, but a king of the chat designation nonetheless. Congratulations, Zane. Thank you very much for that good hearty laugh. I appreciate it.
Capitalism of, what I call sometimes the problem of fake technology. This, like, so much money is made, there's so much hype is generated around things that turn out to be, I would say, inadequate solutions to the problems they claim to solve, even if they were real, but also they're not real. So, like, Theranos machines were not an answer to the lack of universal healthcare, but also they were completely fake, right?
Wait, you're blaming Theranos on the evils of capitalism? You're fucking blaming Elizabeth Holmes on the evils of capitalism? Guess what, dude? Socialists lie too. Fucking Elizabeth Holmes, fucking women, fucking CEOs forever with that bullshit.
Self-driving cars don't actually resolve a lot of the problems of car-centric development, or the resource extraction issues around lithium and batteries and so on, but also self-driving cars are fake.
They're not fake.
Crypto does not solve the problems of the financial.
Self-driving cars are not fake. I've been in a self-driving car. Has anyone else been in a self-driving car? I was in a self-driving car in Vegas where they were like doing a pilot test of self-driving cars, and it was like an Uber. It was a fucking Uber self-driving car. My family escaped Cuba and Venezuela, and nothing he says is true. He conveniently leaves out the persecution and tyranny of the government. Oh yeah, and we're going to start seeing that in Brazil too. Did anyone catch what Glenn Greenwald was putting out about Brazil? Because apparently Brazil is like is really, like, I mean, the censorship in Brazil with this after their insurrection with their new communist government, like, the censorship in Brazil is ripe. So Brazil is going the way of Venezuela. It's very sad. Being in a self-driving car was actually kind of unnerving, if I'm honest about it, because it was like, it really, I mean, so how they were testing it, it was like, it was Uber drivers, but like they weren't actually driving. They were in the front seat. So if something needed to be like done with the self-driving car, they were there to like do it, but they weren't touching the wheel or anything. The car was driving itself, and it was actually a really, really, really unnerving experience.
Systems, also, it's not money, it's a scam. And so that to me, and so that's sort of where I'm trying to sort of work through that and think through what it says about the environment we are in, that we are being presented, on one level we are being presented with these sort of capitalist techno solutions that don't really get at, that are
you were afraid of getting in an accident, essentially.
On the one level, the things that we need, the things that most fundamentally need to happen in order for us to live better lives and to sort of make it through the climate crisis, those are things that capitalism cannot provide because it can't make them profitable. But the second-rate solutions that capitalism can come up with and try to make money on are themselves not even, like, on their own terms, real. So to me, that's sort of that comes to.
So he thinks that there's no profit in solving a problem that supposedly plagues all of humanity. You really think that there is no possible way to solve a problem that your position plagues every single person on the planet? Bro, that's exactly what capitalism is. Capitalism is about providing solutions to people by providing them with products or services that they need because it solves some sort of problem for them or some sort of need for them. That's precisely what capitalism is. Are you going to tell me, okay, so we can talk about the efficacy of the vaccine, and that's not the point I'm making. I'm about to make a different point. But for a while, people like this guy who literally just said that the pandemic is still a real thing, this was given a month ago. For a while, people like this guy were like, hail Pfizer! Pfizer will save us all! Pfizer is the greatest thing ever! All hail Pfizer! Get your Pfizer shot! Pfizer is a capitalist company. Pfizer has made hundreds of billions of dollars by providing their totally effective and not at all problematic vaccine to the world. You're going to tell me capitalism can't solve problems when you were hailing Pfizer for the last 2 fucking years? Okay. All right.
Just sort of like, I don't want, like any Marxist, I don't want to look like I'm saying this is sort of this is the final like contradiction of capitalism that it can't overcome, because I don't think there is any such thing. But it is a very real big contradiction, and it's the one that I'm the most interested in looking at now. Like, rather than if For Futures was about what could we do if we like liberated all these great technology from the capitalist relations of production, now this project is about what does it mean that capitalism seems incapable of even producing any technology we would want to make use of.
Wait, what? Capitalism produces no technology that we want to make use of? What the fuck are you doing right now, bro? You're giving a talk via technology that was produced by capitalism. This guy probably has a Mac. How much you want to bet this asshole has a Mac? And no shade on PC users, but we all know that Macs are like significantly more expensive just because they can be. Because they're better, but like they were much better when Steve Jobs was still with us. But nonetheless, how much you want to bet this asshole has an iPhone? And he's telling me that capitalism can't produce technology? Yeah, do you exactly, Steven? We're friends again. Do you even have the internet, bro?
Okay, great. We have a question from Gabe who asks, I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the role of the states in the socialist future, and particularly thinking about this in relation to some of the debates you mentioned around degrowth and allowing some space for further development in the third world.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. I mean, a lot of this, again, so like the state in a capitalist society is for its primary function is to preserve capitalist class relations. But there is also this question of like, the more things need to happen at scale, the more you need some sort of institution, something like a state, to organize them. And so when you're talking about, if you're talking about some like Jason, project of development, that cannot sort of happen in a small scale decentralized way, then you need something that looks like a state. And then the problems of democratic accountability and all of that come up. They would come up in a different way if that state was not primarily concerned with protecting the property rights and the prerogatives of a class of wealthy capital accumulators. But yeah, I think it's I mean, that's why there's sort of like in the socialism chapter of For Futures, there's clearly a state of some kind, or something that looks like a state, and in the communist chapter there kind of isn't, because that is sort of the Marxist premise of the state withering away. Is it withers away because there's sort of no need for it. Everything can be handled in enough of a sort of decentralized and distributed way that people can provide for themselves and each other without constructing these massive institutions, which then create the problems of the state. But yeah, that would be my sort of brief answer to where that fits in, is that like the climate crisis is the problem of the state and the problem of addressing the climate crisis are very closely intertwined, because so much of what we have to do to adapt to and mitigate the climate crisis has to be done at a large scale, and therefore has to be done with some kind of a state-like institution.
Okay, we have another question from the audience, which is, how can these futures help us think about the possible futures of higher education, particularly as researchers and teachers?
That's a good question.
That's an interesting one. I mean, especially now as we're, as education is itself in crisis, it's, we need to think about what education can be other than, something that justifies itself through the production of a capitalist labor force. That has been what, certainly, in my experience with, university and college education, on the one hand, we were told to take out student debt and go to college to get good jobs. We were told in graduate school that we could get jobs, that are now disappearing and being, replaced with precarious labor. And I think, and you see there's so much like the miracle of education, both higher education and also like K-12 education. The miracle of it to me is that it is kept running by people who are so poorly paid and ill-treated, and yet find so much of value in what they're doing, and see so much, the human value in what education can be, even under these terrible institutional conditions, that they continue to do it. Now, as with many aspects of current capitalist society, the system is sort of eating its seed corn and sort of burning through its reserves as fast as possible in such a way that, like, I don't know how much longer things can really go on in this way. But the fact essentially that there's what has happened in education is, to me, evidence of some deeply non-capitalist and communist impulses and motivations that have to be very powerful if they managed.
I want to listen to what he just said again. Hang on.
As possible in such a way that, like, I don't know how much longer things can really go on in this way. But the fact essentially that there's what has happened in education is, to me, evidence of some deeply non-capitalist and communist impulses and motivations that have to be very powerful if they have, if the system has managed to not completely collapse, given the attempt to completely subordinate it to very short-term capitalist interests in a way that you would think that everybody.
So he is suggesting that the only reason that public education is still around is because they've given into their communist impulses to subvert the Wow! This is why we listen to the whole presentation, folks. This right here. Holy shit. Correct, Peter. Correct. We agree with you. Thank you for saying the quiet part out loud.
Would have flooded by now.
Okay, thank you. Our audience question queue is empty again, so if you have any last questions, please drop them in. If not, then I think this one we'll end on this one, which is, you mentioned that you get asked frequently, like, what are some things that you would change about the book? And you mentioned that your sort of acknowledgement that we might not know what Dogecoin is in a few years, which, if you're a denizen of the internet, you still know what Dogecoin is, but are there other things that you would like to change, or are there even like other futures that maybe you would, tweak the access and you think are sort of maybe like more likely to happen or more helpful for thinking? Or do you think that this, that 2016 was still a good vantage point for looking into the future?
Yeah, I think the basic parameters of it have stayed, somewhat the same for me. The sort of the emphases have changed, obviously, in certain ways, but like, I think the era of capitalism we are in is basically still the same one. To use the William Gibson cliche, the future is still here and unevenly distributed. in both its sort of more hopeful and more repressive dimensions. I mean, there are definitely things, and there's certain things like that we talked about, some of the things that I could have included and didn't, just for the sake of having a sort of clean thought experiment. I certainly think I would probably now, if I was doing this, be working through more, like thinking through sort of social reproduction as a framework more. And so that would mean that like gender and family and how basically how the society as a human institution is reproduced would play into it more. I mentioned Ursula Le Guin would get more play. I think that's in terms of how I think about what capitalism is and how to think about it as a system that reproduces itself in time. That's the piece that I think, I talk about it a little bit in certain parts of the book, but it's certainly something that's more top of mind for me now in terms of thinking about like, again, capitalism is not just as a thing that has to be understood in time and in human time, and therefore has to reproduce itself generationally, meaning both biological reproduction but also cultural and social reproduction. And so, so bringing that in, I think, is probably the number one, and I think that could tie into all these different dimensions of the futures that we talked about. And so that's probably where I'd say my own thinking has evolved and deepened in the time since I wrote it.
Okay, we do have one last audience question, which is from Julia, who asks, what do you think it would be best to do now as citizens of the world in the US to create one of the better possible futures to the best of our abilities?
Organize with other people. And I'm not even gonna say that can mean, that can mean as part of electoral type of campaigning, but that can mean building, your local mutual aid networks. It can mean organizing your workplace, obviously, but as Miriam Kabel likes to say, all the best things are done with other people. And that all, part of my intention in writing the book and trying to position it as a work, not of prediction, but of possibilities, right? Was to say, this is not where we're going. This is some parameters of what might be possible, and where we go, people make their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. But the people making their own history are important. But that can only be done collectively. And we are in a society that in many ways tries to fragment and atomize us. And the pandemic, of course, has intensified some of those tendencies. So find ways to be in community with and organize with other people in whatever context you happen to find yourself. That sounds sort of glib, but I also think it's just sort of fundamentally true and fundamentally the only thing.
That's true for us too, by the way.
And that recognition,
he's not wrong about this,
is prior to and more fundamental than the specifics of political strategy and organizing, which are important, of course, but you don't get there until you start with that thinking on that baseline.
Okay, wonderful. So I think with that, we will end this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Peter. I think I learned a lot from our discussion. And again, thank you to the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy for hosting us. And
yes, for the study of democracy.
Peter, do you have anything to add?
No, just thanks. It's been a great conversation. I'm amazed people still want to talk about this book all these years later. So, but it was good to take
for the study of democracy. Yet we just spent the last hour and 20 minutes talking about the study of socialism. But guys, thank you for coming to Socialism Saturday tonight. That will conclude our viewing of socialism. As a reminder, we do Socialism Saturday on Saturdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on my main channel. It's going live a little bit later than I normally do during the week. I normally go live at 5 p.m. Eastern Time because my weekend too. I got other stuff to do. So we go live at 6 p.m. Eastern on Saturdays for socialism. I hope you'll return next week. I'll find another dystopian thing. And guys, just so you know, and I put this out to my community earlier, I am trying to make a list of legitimately socialist YouTube channels because, we need to be able to distinguish between the real socialists and, the champagne socialists. If you have real socialist content, please send it to me. Either email it to me, activelyunwoke@gmail.com, or you can send me a DM on Twitter, because my DMs are open, or you can bring it to one of my groups, or you can leave a comment on my Substack, whatever. If you find legitimately socialist content, it would be really helpful for me because sometimes curating this stuff is a little bit difficult because it's hard to find it, okay? And so if you see it out there, I'd like to make a list. I'd like to I monitor different socialists that you see coming up over and over again, what channels are going on, things like that, to be able to do Socialism Saturday. But you know what? It's a team sport, and if you guys want to help, you absolutely can. All right, guys, I take Sundays off from streaming. But as a reminder, we are doing movie night tomorrow night in my supporter Discord. We are watching Equilibrium. And so if you would like to join us in the supporter Discord, if you are a supporter on any of like my mediums, to include YouTube, Substack, Locals, or Patreon, you will get a link to join the supporter Discord. But if you are not, you can become a supporter by heading over to activelyunwoke.com. And you got several options. Number one, you can join my locals community, $5 a month, $50 a year, and that'll get you access to it. Number two, you can join my Patreon community, $5 a month, all the way up to $250 a month, depending on what types of perks you want. That will get you access to movie night in the supporter Discord, or you can become a supporter on my Substack, which I really do recommend, guys. I'm trying to do a membership drive on my Substack right now to be able to continue to keep all of the articles for free on my Substack. Right now, if you head over to Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com, you will see the Unwoke Roundup, which is a full briefing of all of the Unwoke content that I've made for you this week, to include autistic sex education, to include the Transmaxing Manifesto, to include a new article in the Woke Mind series, etc., etc., etc. So you get lots of options there. And I do really want to hit 100 new paying supporters in my Substack this month. And if I don't hit it, I'm going to have to put up a paywall. But if I do hit it, I'm keeping all my articles and all my work free for everyone. And this will get you into the supporter Discord. So actually, if you are a supporter on my Substack and you're not in the Discord yet, just go to this Unwoke Roundup article. Oh, I'm not going to do that. I can't show you that. But there are actually links at the bottom. There are actually links at the bottom of the article where you can join the supporter Discord if you are a supporter. So guys, I will see you guys tomorrow for movie night. We will see you Monday at 5 p.m. for the next stream. Please mount the like button on your way out the door, and we will see you guys soon. Bye!